Miss Marple, and the Christmas Market Murder. Welcome to Warm Pages. I'm your host, Edward, and I'm truly glad you're here. Before we begin, did you know that most of our listeners aren't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these cozy, timeless mysteries, subscribing is the best way to support Warm Pages and ensure you never miss another intriguing case. It's completely free. And of course, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? I read every single comment. Now, settle in with your warm drink, and let's begin. Chapter 1. Death Among the Stalls. The first snow of December had fallen softly upon St. Mary Mead, transforming the village square into a scene that might have graced the cover of a Christmas card. Miss Jane Marple pulled her woolen coat more tightly about her shoulders as she made her way through the cheerful chaos of the annual Christmas market, her keen eyes taking in every detail with the practiced observation of one who had spent a lifetime watching human nature unfold in all its fascinating complexity. The wooden stalls stood in neat rows beneath strings of twinkling lights that cast a warm golden glow over the cobblestones. The air was rich with the mingled scents of roasted chestnuts, mulled wine, and the pine garlands that decorated every available surface. Children darted between the stalls with excited squeals, their breath forming small clouds in the crisp December air, while their parents followed at a more sedate pace, arms laden with packages wrapped in festive paper. Miss Marple paused before a particularly elaborate stall that had been constructed to resemble a fairy tale gingerbread house, complete with candy cane pillars and windows outlined in white icing. The sign above proclaimed Thornfield's traditional treats in elegant script, and the woman behind the counter was arranging a display of Christmas cookies with the precision of an artist. Margaret Thornfield was a handsome woman in her late 50s, with silver hair swept back in an elegant chignon and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She wore a pristine white apron over a forest green dress, and her movements were quick and efficient as she served customers with practiced ease. "Miss Marple," Margaret called out, her face lighting up with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "How lovely to see you at our little market. You simply must try my new gingerbread recipe. It's been in my family for generations." Miss Marple accepted the offered cookie with a gracious smile, though something in Margaret's tone struck her as slightly artificial. There was an undertone of possessiveness when she spoke of our little market that seemed at odds with the community spirit such an event was meant to embody. "It's perfectly delicious, my dear," Miss Marple said, and indeed it was. "You've created something quite magical here. The whole market has such a wonderful atmosphere." Margaret's smile broadened with evident pride. "I do try to maintain certain standards. Not everyone appreciates the effort it takes to create something truly special, but I believe in preserving tradition properly." Her emphasis on the word properly carried a subtle criticism that Miss Marple filed away for future consideration. As Miss Marple continued her leisurely tour of the market, she became aware of undercurrents of tension that seemed at odds with the festive atmosphere. At the corner stall selling hand-knitted scarves and mittens, Mrs. Fletcher's thin face wore an expression of barely concealed bitterness as she watched Margaret's busy gingerbread house. "She's got the prime location again," Mrs. Fletcher muttered to her neighbour, loud enough for Miss Marple to overhear. 3 years running now. Some of us have been at this market longer than she has, but apparently that doesn't count for anything anymore." Near the fountain in the centre of the square, a young man with nervous hands and anxious eyes was arranging a modest display of hand-carved wooden toys. Miss Marple approached his stall with interest, admiring the craftsmanship of a particularly charming rocking horse. "These are beautifully made," she observed to the young man, who couldn't have been more than 25. "Did you carve them yourself?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Timothy Mills, that's me. I applied for a proper stall space, but—" He glanced nervously toward Margaret's gingerbread house. "Well, there wasn't room for everyone, apparently." Miss Marple noted the bitterness that crept into his voice, so at odds with his gentle demeanour. She also noticed that his display table was smaller than the others and positioned in a less favourable location, where foot traffic was lighter. The evening shadows were beginning to lengthen when Miss Marple encountered Mr. Blackwood, the market manager, near the entrance to the square. He was a portly man in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, but his usual cheerful demeanour seemed strained. "Everything running smoothly, Mr. Blackwood?" Miss Marple inquired politely. "Oh, yes, quite smoothly," he replied, but his fingers drummed nervously against the clipboard he carried. "Though there are always administrative challenges, you understand. Financial considerations, vendor agreements, that sort of thing." He lowered his voice slightly. "Not everyone appreciates how complex these matters can be." Miss Marple was about to respond when raised voices drew their attention toward Margaret's stall. The market organizer was engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with a well-dressed man in an expensive overcoat. "The terms were clearly stated," Margaret was saying, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "If certain standards aren't maintained, adjustments must be made." The man replied in tones too low to be overheard, but his gesture toward the other stalls was unmistakably dismissive. Margaret nodded approvingly, and Miss Marple caught the words "commercial viability" and "year-round operation" before the conversation moved beyond earshot. As the evening wore on and the crowds began to thin, Miss Marple found herself lingering near the market's edge, drawn by some instinct she couldn't quite name. The vendors were beginning to pack up their wares, and the cheerful bustle was giving way to the quieter sounds of clean-up and departure. Margaret Thornfield was among the last to close, as was her custom. Miss Marple watched as she carefully arranged her remaining cookies in storage containers and began the process of securing her elaborate stall for the night. From a thermos that she kept apart from her customer service area, Margaret poured herself a steaming cup of mulled wine, the rich aroma carrying on the cold air. This was Margaret's evening ritual, Miss Marple had been told. Each night after serving customers all day, she would reward herself with a cup of her special blend of mulled wine, while reviewing the day's receipts and planning for the next. Miss Marple was about to bid her good night and head home when a crash from the direction of the gingerbread house made her turn sharply. Margaret's thermos lay shattered on the cobblestones, its contents steaming in the cold air, while Margaret herself was clutching at her throat, her face contorted in pain and terror. "Help!" she gasped, her voice barely audible. "Please, help me!" By the time Miss Marple reached her side, Margaret Thornfield had collapsed among her carefully arranged Christmas cookies, her body convulsing briefly before lying still. The sweet scent of mulled wine mingled with something else, something bitter and acrid that made Miss Marple step back instinctively. Dr. Haydock arrived within minutes of being summoned, his medical bag in hand and his expression grave. After a brief examination, he looked up at the small crowd that had gathered. "I'm afraid she's gone," he announced quietly, "and unless I'm very much mistaken, this wasn't a natural death. That smell! I believe we're looking at cyanide poisoning." As the police were called and the Christmas market was transformed from a scene of festive celebration into something far more sinister, Miss Marple stood quietly in the shadows, her mind already working. Margaret Thornfield had been killed in the very place that represented community warmth and holiday spirit, poisoned by the traditional drink that symbolized hospitality and welcome. Someone had used the Christmas market's own symbols of generosity and tradition as weapons, and Miss Marple suspected that the motive lay not in the festive atmosphere that surrounded them, but in the tensions and resentments that had been simmering beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful community celebration. Chapter 2. The Poisoned Mulled Wine. Inspector Slack arrived at the Christmas market with his usual air of brisk efficiency, his sharp features set in lines of professional concentration as he surveyed the scene. The festive lights still twinkled overhead, but their cheerful glow now seemed incongruous against the gravity of the situation that had unfolded beneath them. Miss Marple remained discreetly in the background as the inspector began his preliminary examination, though her observant eyes missed nothing of the proceedings. She had encountered Inspector Slack on several previous occasions, and while she found his methods somewhat heavy-handed, she respected his thoroughness in matters of criminal investigation. Right then, Inspector Slack announced to the small group of vendors and officials who had remained at the scene, "I'll need statements from everyone who was present this evening, particularly those who had contact with the deceased in her final hours." Dr. Haydock, who had been examining Margaret's body with careful attention, looked up from his work. "Inspector, I can confirm my initial assessment. This is most certainly cyanide poisoning. The victim would have experienced rapid onset of symptoms followed by death within minutes of ingestion." "And the source of the poison?" Inspector Slack inquired, making notes in his official notebook. "The thermos," Dr. Haydock replied, indicating the shattered container that lay among the spilled mulled wine. "The victim was in the habit of drinking from her personal supply each evening. The cyanide was added to that specific container, not to any of the wine she served to customers throughout the day." Miss Marple stepped forward carefully, her voice gentle but clear. "If I may, Inspector, I believe this detail is rather significant. Mrs. Thornfield's evening ritual was quite well known among the market community. She made rather a point of it, in fact." Inspector Slack looked up from his notes with the expression of one who has learned, through experience, to pay attention to Miss Marple's observations. "Go on, Miss Marple." "She would always pour herself a cup of mulled wine from her private thermos at closing time," Miss Marple continued. "It was a blend she prepared specially for herself, quite different from what she served to customers. She was rather proud of her recipe, which she claimed contained more expensive spices than the commercial version." Mr. Blackwood, who had been standing nearby wringing his hands nervously, nodded in confirmation. "That's quite right, Miss Marple. Margaret was very particular about her evening cup. She said it helped her unwind after a long day of dealing with customers. She used cardamom and real vanilla pods, things that would have been too costly to include in the customer blend." "And who would have known about this routine?" Inspector Slack asked, his pen poised above his notebook. "Why, practically everyone who's been involved with the market," Mrs. Fletcher interjected, her voice carrying that edge of resentment Miss Marple had noticed earlier. "Margaret never made any secret of her little luxuries. She was always going on about her superior ingredients and her family recipes." Timothy Mills, the young woodcarver, shifted uncomfortably where he stood. She mentioned it when I applied for a stall. Said that running a successful business meant knowing when to invest in quality for yourself, even if you had to economize elsewhere." Miss Marple found this comment particularly interesting. "And where did Mrs. Thornfield keep her personal thermos during the day?" "Behind the counter," Mr. Blackwood replied. "She had a small shelf there, partially hidden by the decorative gingerbread panels. She was quite careful about keeping her personal items separate from the customer service area." Inspector Slack made another note. So the killer would have needed access to that specific area and a knowledge of Mrs. Thornfield's habits. Dr. Haydock, who had been listening to this exchange while completing his examination, looked up with a grave expression. "There's something else, Inspector. The timing of the poisoning is significant. Based on the victim's condition when I arrived, I would estimate that the cyanide was added to the mulled wine no more than 30 minutes before she consumed it." "Meaning?" Inspector Slack prompted. "Meaning the killer was present at the market during the evening hours, likely someone who remained after most of the customers had departed." Dr. Haydock packed his medical instruments with careful precision. This wasn't a case of poisoning the thermos early in the day and waiting for the victim to drink from it. The killer acted shortly before Mrs. Thornfield's death. Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. That would suggest someone familiar with her precise routine, someone who knew not only that she drank from the thermos each evening, but approximately when she would do so. "The market closes at 7 o'clock, Mr. Blackwood offered. "Margaret usually began her closing routine around 1:15. After the last customers had departed, she was very methodical about it." Inspector Slack surveyed the assembled group with sharp eyes. "I'll need to know the whereabouts of everyone who was present this evening between 6:30 and 7:30. Who was here, what they were doing, and whether they had opportunity to approach Mrs. Thornfield's stall." Mrs. Fletcher bristled visibly. "Are you suggesting that one of us, that someone we know?" She left the sentence unfinished, but her meaning was clear. "I'm suggesting that murder has been committed, and it's my job to determine by whom," Inspector Slack replied curtly. Now, Mrs. Fletcher, where were you during the time period in question? I was packing up my own stall, naturally, she replied with dignity. My scarves and mittens don't put themselves away, though I did notice that Margaret seemed to be having quite an animated conversation with someone around 6:45. With whom? The inspector asked immediately. Mrs. Fletcher frowned, clearly trying to recall the details. I couldn't see clearly from my position, but it appeared to be that gentleman in the expensive overcoat who was here earlier. They were speaking in low voices, but Margaret seemed agitated. Miss Marple remembered the well-dressed man she had observed earlier. Did you hear any part of their conversation, Mrs. Fletcher? Only a word here and there. Something about arrangements and timing, but I wasn't deliberately listening, you understand. Timothy Mills spoke up hesitantly. I saw him too. He left around 7 o'clock, just as I was finishing with my own stall. He walked toward the car park behind the church. Inspector Slack made additional notes. We'll need to identify this individual. Mr. Blackwood, do you know who he might have been? The market manager's expression became even more troubled. Well, yes, I believe so. His name is Charles Hendricks. He's been in negotiations with Margaret about certain business matters. What sort of business matters? Miss Marple asked gently. Mr. Blackwood glanced around nervously at the other vendors. Perhaps we might discuss this privately, Inspector. It's rather delicate. Inspector Slack nodded curtly. We'll arrange that. In the meantime, I want this area secured. No one is to disturb anything until our investigation is complete. As the crowd began to disperse under police supervision, Miss Marple found herself walking alongside Dr. Haydock toward the edge of the square. The doctor's expression was thoughtful as he considered the evening's tragic events. A most unpleasant business, he observed quietly. Margaret Thornfield was not universally beloved, but she certainly didn't deserve such a fate. No, indeed, Miss Marple agreed. Though I must say, Doctor, there seemed to be rather more tension among the vendors than one might expect at such a community gathering. Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. Margaret had been making changes to the market in recent years. Not everyone approved of her methods, though most people kept their objections to themselves. What sort of changes? Miss Marple inquired, though she suspected she already knew the answer. More commercial, less traditional, higher fees for the vendors, stricter standards for participation, that sort of thing. She claimed it was necessary to maintain quality, but he shrugged eloquently. Miss Marple considered this information as they walked. The killer had chosen a method that corrupted the very symbol of hospitality and tradition that Margaret had been accused of exploiting. There was something almost poetic about the justice of it, though Miss Marple firmly reminded herself that murder was never justified, regardless of the victim's failings. Doctor, she said suddenly, you mentioned that the cyanide acted quickly. Would the killer have needed to remain nearby to ensure the poison took effect? Dr. Haydock paused in his walking, clearly intrigued by the question. Not necessarily, though they might well have wanted to observe the results of their handiwork. Why do you ask? I was wondering whether this was a crime of passion or a more calculated affair, Miss Marple replied. Someone who kills in anger might flee immediately, while someone with a more methodical mind might stay to witness the consequences. An interesting distinction, the doctor mused, though I'm not sure how one might determine which applies in this case. Miss Marple smiled slightly. Oh, I think the evidence will tell us, Doctor. It nearly always does, if one knows how to read it properly. As they reached the edge of the square, Miss Marple turned back for one final look at the Christmas market. The police had strung tape around Margaret's gingerbread house stall, and the festive decorations now seemed to mock the tragedy that had occurred beneath them. Someone had used Margaret's own traditions against her, corrupting the symbols of Christmas hospitality to commit murder. The question that remained was whether the killer had acted from personal grievance, or from some broader motive related to the changes Margaret had been making to the beloved community tradition. Miss Marple suspected that the answer lay somewhere in the complex web of relationships and resentments that had been developing beneath the surface of St. Mary Mead's Christmas market, and she was determined to unravel that web before the killer could strike again. Chapter 3. Secrets in the Gingerbread House. The following morning dawned grey and overcast, with a bitter wind that seemed to cut through even the warmest clothing. Miss Marple made her way to the village square early, drawn by that peculiar fascination that unsolved mysteries always held for her. The Christmas market stood silent now, its festive decorations looking forlorn in the pale winter light. Inspector Slack was already present, directing a small team of constables as they conducted a thorough search of Margaret Thornfield's elaborate stall. The gingerbread house construction that had seemed so charming the previous evening now appeared almost sinister in its fairy tale extravagance, like something from a darker sort of children's story. "Ah, Miss Marple," the inspector greeted her with what might have been relief. "I was hoping you might stop by. Your observations yesterday evening were quite helpful." Miss Marple inclined her head graciously. "I do hope I'm not interfering with your investigation, Inspector. I simply felt drawn to see the scene again in daylight." "Not at all. In fact, we've made some rather interesting discoveries this morning." Inspector Slack gestured toward the gingerbread house stall. It seems Mrs. Thornfield's little architectural fantasy contained more than decorative elements. One of the constables emerged from behind the counter holding a metal file box. "Found this in a hidden compartment, sir, concealed behind one of the candy cane pillars." Inspector Slack opened the box carefully, revealing a collection of papers, correspondence, and what appeared to be financial records. Mrs. Thornfield was apparently more organised in her business affairs than one might have expected from such a whimsical display. Miss Marple moved closer, her curiosity thoroughly aroused. Hidden compartments? How very intriguing. One might wonder what sort of business records required such secrecy. "Indeed," the inspector replied grimly, extracting a sheaf of letters from the top of the collection. "And it appears that Mrs. Thornfield had been receiving some rather unpleasant correspondence." He held up a letter written on plain white paper in block capitals. Miss Marple could see enough of the text to read, "You have stolen Christmas from this village. Step down or face the consequences." "How many such letters are there?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "4 that we've found so far, all in similar handwriting, all making similar demands." Inspector Slack's expression was grim. "The most recent is dated just 3 days ago." Miss Marple studied the letter more closely, though she was careful not to handle the evidence. The handwriting appears deliberately disguised, but the paper and ink are quite ordinary. Nothing that would help identify the sender, I suspect. Unfortunately not, though the content is clear enough. Someone wanted Mrs. Thornfield removed from her position as market organiser, and they were prepared to make threats to achieve that goal. Dr. Haydock arrived as they were examining the correspondence, his medical bag in hand and his expression professionally grave. "Inspector, I have the preliminary results of the post-mortem examination if you are ready to hear them." "Certainly, Doctor. What can you tell us?" "Death was definitely caused by cyanide poisoning, as I suspected. A substantial dose, administered in the mulled wine. The victim would have experienced symptoms within minutes and death within a quarter hour of consumption." Dr. Haydock paused, consulting his notes. "There's something else, though. The cyanide was mixed with something sweet, probably honey or sugar syrup, which would have masked the bitter taste." Miss Marple found this detail particularly significant. "That suggests considerable premeditation, doesn't it, Doctor? The killer took care to ensure that Mrs. Thornfield would consume the entire dose." "Precisely. This wasn't a crime of sudden passion. Someone planned this murder quite carefully." Inspector Slack continued his examination of the hidden papers. "There's more here than threatening letters. Financial records, vendor agreements, correspondence with various suppliers, and—" He paused, frowning. "Letters from someone called Charles Hendricks, the gentleman Mrs. Fletcher mentioned seeing yesterday evening." "What do those letters contain?" Miss Marple inquired. "Business propositions, by the look of it. References to expanding the market's commercial potential and year-round operations. There's mention of substantial financial investment and—" The inspector's frown deepened. "Franchise opportunities." Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December weather. Franchise opportunities? It appears that Mrs. Thornfield had been negotiating to sell the Christmas market name and concept to a commercial enterprise. Mr. Hendricks represents a company that specializes in creating themed shopping experiences. The implications of this revelation settled over the small group like a cloud. Miss Marple thought of the traditional craftspeople she had observed the previous evening, the family businesses that had been part of St. Mary Mead's Christmas market for years. "And I don't suppose any of the current vendors were aware of these negotiations?" she asked quietly. From the correspondence, it appears Mrs. Thornfield was keeping the matter strictly confidential, though there are references to removing unsuitable elements and upgrading the vendor base to professional standards. Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully. "Inspector, might I ask what other documents were found in the hidden compartment?" "Certainly." He lifted out a leather-bound notebook. "What appears to be a recipe collection, though some of these entries are rather curious." Miss Marple examined the notebook with great interest. The recipes were written in Margaret's neat handwriting, but as she read through them, certain inconsistencies became apparent. "Inspector, look at this entry for gingerbread. It's labelled as Thornfield Family Traditional Recipe, passed down for generations, but the measurements and ingredients are identical to a recipe published in Mrs. Beeton's cookbook." Inspector Slack raised his eyebrows. "You're certain of that?" "Quite certain. I have Mrs. Beeton's book in my own kitchen, and I've used that very recipe many times." Miss Marple turned several more pages. "And here's a mulled wine recipe claimed as another family tradition, but it's clearly copied from a magazine article. See how the instructions match the commercial style rather than traditional family notation?" Dr. Haydock peered over her shoulder. "Are you suggesting that Mrs. Thornfield was claiming other people's recipes as her own family traditions?" "It certainly appears that way, though I suppose one might argue that all traditional recipes are shared knowledge eventually." Inspector Slack made notes as he spoke. "Still, it suggests a pattern of, shall we say, creative interpretation of the truth where traditions were concerned." The constable searching the rear of the stall called out, "Inspector, there's something else back here. Looks like architectural plans or blueprints." They gathered around as the constable spread out several large sheets of paper. The plans showed the Christmas market square, but with significant modifications. Where the current wooden stall stood, the drawings showed permanent structures made of brick and steel, with modern retail fixtures and professional signage. "Good heavens," Miss Marple murmured. "These aren't plans for preserving the traditional market. They're plans for replacing it entirely." Inspector Slack studied the drawings with growing concern. "Look at these vendor spaces. They're much larger than the current stalls, and there are far fewer of them. Most of the current vendors wouldn't have been able to afford spaces in this new configuration." "And the architectural style," Dr. Haydock observed. "It's completely at odds with the village's character, more like something one might find in a modern shopping centre." Miss Marple noticed additional details in the plans. There are provisions for year-round operation, with heating and electrical systems throughout. The investment required would have been enormous. "Which explains Mr. Hendrick's involvement," Inspector Slack concluded. "Mrs. Thornfield couldn't have financed such a project on her own." As they continued to examine the evidence, Miss Marple became increasingly aware of the scope of Margaret's deception. The woman had presented herself as a guardian of Christmas tradition, while secretly planning to destroy everything that made the market special. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I wonder if we might speak with some of the vendors who have been involved with the market for many years. If Mrs. Thornfield was planning such dramatic changes, there might have been signs that someone noticed." "An excellent suggestion, though I suspect we'll find that Mrs. Thornfield was very careful to keep her real intentions hidden." Miss Marple gazed at the gingerbread house stall with its whimsical decorations and fairy tale appearance. Like everything else about Margaret Thornfield, it had been designed to create an impression that was fundamentally false. The cheerful exterior had concealed secrets that would have devastated the community that trusted her. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe we're dealing with someone who killed not just Margaret Thornfield, but the betrayal of everything she claimed to represent. The question is whether that someone acted alone, or whether they had help from others who discovered her true intentions. The wind picked up, rattling the decorative elements of the abandoned stalls and sending dead leaves skittering across the cobblestones. The Christmas market that had seemed so magical the previous evening now felt hollow and sad, as if the discovery of Margaret's deception had drained all the joy from the place. Miss Marple suspected that before this investigation was concluded, they would uncover secrets that went far deeper than hidden compartments and stolen recipes. Someone had been driven to murder by the scope of Margaret's betrayal, and that someone was still walking free among the people of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 4. The Vendor's Last Sale. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the morning visiting the homes of various market vendors, ostensibly to offer condolences, but actually to gather information about Margaret Thornfield's final day. Her first stop was Mrs. Fletcher's modest cottage on Elm Street, where she found the bitter woman more than willing to discuss her grievances against the deceased market organiser. "I won't pretend to mourn her," Mrs. Fletcher declared as she served tea in her small sitting room. "Margaret Thornfield was destroying everything that made our Christmas market special, and she was doing it deliberately." Miss Marple accepted her teacup with gracious thanks. "That's rather a strong accusation, my dear. What makes you say she was acting deliberately?" Mrs. Fletcher's thin face flushed with remembered anger. "Because she told me so herself, just yesterday afternoon. Had the nerve to come to my stall and inform me that my standards weren't meeting the new requirements for the market." "What sort of requirements?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "Professional display standards, she called them. Said my hand-knitted items looked too rustic, and that customers expected a more upscale shopping experience." Mrs. Fletcher's voice dripped with disdain. "Upscale shopping experience at a village Christmas market that's been running the same way for 20 years. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "And what did she suggest you do about these concerns?" "Suggested?" Mrs. Fletcher laughed bitterly. "She didn't suggest anything. She gave me an ultimatum. Either I invested in professional display cases and upgraded my packaging to meet her new standards, or I wouldn't be welcome back next year." This information aligned disturbingly well with the architectural plans they had discovered in Margaret's hidden compartment. "That must have been very upsetting for you." "Upsetting? It was devastating. I've been knitting these items all year, looking forward to the Christmas market. It's not just the money, though. Heaven knows I need that. It's being part of the community, feeling useful." Mrs. Fletcher's voice cracked slightly. "Margaret knew perfectly well I couldn't afford professional display equipment. She was trying to force me out." Miss Marple leaned forward with sympathetic interest. "Did she give any indication of why these changes were necessary?" "Oh yes, she was quite eloquent on that subject. Said the market needed to evolve with the times and attract a more discerning clientele. Claimed that traditional family businesses were holding back the market's potential for growth. How very unfortunate. And were other vendors receiving similar ultimatums?" Mrs. Fletcher nodded vigorously. "Timothy Mills, for certain. I saw Margaret at his stall earlier in the day, and the poor boy looked absolutely crushed afterward, and I heard her having quite a heated discussion with Mr. Blackwood about vendor fees." Miss Marple made her way next to Timothy Mills' small flat above the village bakery, where she found the young woodcarver sitting despondently among his unsold toys. His modest living space was crowded with half-finished carvings and the tools of his trade, testament to both his skill and his financial struggles. "Miss Marple," he said, rising awkwardly to his feet, "I heard about what happened to Mrs. Thornfield. Terrible business." "Indeed it is, Timothy. I hope you don't mind my stopping by. I wanted to see how you were managing after yesterday's events." Timothy's hands fidgeted nervously with a piece of wood he had been carving. "I keep thinking I should feel worse about it than I do. I mean, someone died, and that's always tragic. But I can't help feeling that maybe now the market has a chance to go back to what it used to be." Miss Marple settled herself carefully in the only comfortable chair the small room afforded. "Mrs. Thornfield spoke with you yesterday about your participation in the market, I understand." The young man's shoulders sagged. "She told me my work wasn't suitable for her vision of the market's future. Said my toys were too primitive for modern children, and that parents wanted educational toys made from certified materials. "But your toys are beautifully crafted," Miss Marple protested. "I noticed the workmanship yesterday evening." "That's what I thought too. I've been carving since I was 12, learned from my grandfather. Each piece takes hours to complete, and I put so much care into making them safe and beautiful." Timothy's voice grew bitter. "But apparently that doesn't matter if they don't come with fancy packaging and marketing materials." Miss Marple studied the young man's face carefully. What exactly did Mrs. Thornfield propose? "She offered to let me stay in the market if I agreed to sell toys manufactured by a company she was partnering with. Said I could still hand paint them or add personal touches, but the basic construction would be done by machines in a factory." Timothy's laugh was hollow. "She actually seemed to think she was doing me a favour. And your response?" "I told her I'd rather not participate at all than sell factory-made toys as my own work. She didn't seem to understand why I was upset." Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing concern. Margaret's plans had been even more comprehensive than the architectural drawings had suggested. She wasn't just changing the physical structure of the market. She was replacing the vendors themselves with commercial operations. Her final visit of the morning was to Mr. Blackwood's house, where she found the market manager in a state of considerable agitation. His usually tidy appearance was dishevelled, and his hands shook slightly as he showed her into his study. "I've been expecting someone to come asking questions," he said without preamble. "The police, most likely, though I suppose you're acting in that capacity as well, aren't you, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple raised her eyebrows at this directness. "I'm simply trying to understand what happened yesterday evening, Mr. Blackwood. I gather you had some difficulties with Mrs. Thornfield regarding financial matters?" Mr. Blackwood slumped into his desk chair, suddenly looking much older than his years. "Difficulties is putting it mildly. Margaret had been systematically changing the entire financial structure of the market, and she was doing it without consulting anyone." "In what way?" "The vendor fees, for one thing. She'd been raising them each year, claiming increased costs, but the money wasn't being spent on market improvements. It was being diverted into some sort of development fund that she controlled exclusively." Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. "Development fund?" She called it preparation for future expansion, but she wouldn't give any details about what that expansion might involve. When I pressed her for specifics, she told me that financial planning was her responsibility, not mine. That must have been frustrating for someone in your position. Mr. Blackwood's laugh was bitter. "Frustrating doesn't begin to describe it. I've been managing the practical aspects of this market for 8 years, Miss Marple. I know every vendor, every supplier, every detail of what it costs to run this operation. But Margaret had been making decisions that affected everyone without consulting anyone." "What sort of decisions?" "Yesterday alone, she informed 3 vendors that their services would no longer be required after this year. She'd already signed agreements with replacement vendors from London without discussing it with me or the village council." Miss Marple felt a chill of understanding. Replacement vendors? Professional operations? Companies that specialise in seasonal markets and craft fairs? They would have brought their own staff, their own products, their own everything. The local people would have been completely shut out. Did she explain why she felt such changes were necessary? Mr. Blackwood's expression grew increasingly troubled. She said the market needed to become more commercially viable if it was going to survive, claimed that traditional family businesses couldn't compete in the modern retail environment. And what was to be your role in this new arrangement? That's just it, Miss Marple. I don't think I was going to have a role. Margaret had been meeting with outside management companies, discussing professional event coordination services. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. I believe yesterday was meant to be my last day as well, though she hadn't told me so directly. Miss Marple left Mr. Blackwood's house with a heavy heart and a clearer understanding of the scope of Margaret Thornfield's betrayal. The woman had been systematically dismantling everything that made the Christmas market a genuine community event, replacing it with a commercial operation that would have enriched her while excluding the very people who had created its success. As she walked back toward the village square, Miss Marple reflected on the conversation she had just concluded. 3 people had received devastating news from Margaret Thornfield on her final day. news that would have destroyed their livelihoods and their connection to a cherished community tradition. The question that remained was whether one of them had decided that murder was preferable to allowing Margaret to complete her transformation of the Christmas market, or whether someone else, perhaps someone who had discovered the full extent of her plans, had taken action to prevent what they saw as an unforgivable betrayal of trust. The afternoon shadows were lengthening as Miss Marple reached the square, where the abandoned market stall stood like tombstones to a tradition that had died, along with Margaret Thornfield. Someone had committed murder to stop Margaret's commercial ambitions, but Miss Marple suspected that the true victim of this crime was the Christmas market itself, which could never again represent the innocent community celebration it had once been. Chapter 5, Murder Most Festive. Inspector Slack spent the following day conducting formal interviews with all the market vendors, and by evening he had assembled a picture of Margaret Thornfield's activities that was even more disturbing than their initial discoveries had suggested. He found Miss Marple in her garden, tending to her winter roses despite the bitter December cold. "Miss Marple," he called over the garden gate, "I wonder if I might have a word. I believe you'll find our latest findings quite illuminating." Miss Marple set down her pruning shears and invited the inspector into her sitting room, where a cheerful fire was crackling in the grate. She prepared tea while he organised his notes and settled herself to listen with the attention she always gave to matters of criminal investigation. "I've completed interviews with all 12 vendors who participated in this year's Christmas market," Inspector Slack began, consulting his notebook. Without exception, every one of them reported receiving some form of ultimatum from Mrs. Thornfield on the day she died. Miss Marple poured tea into delicate china cups. "Every one of them! How extraordinary!" "Indeed. It appears that December the 15th was meant to be a day of what Mrs. Thornfield called necessary notifications. She had systematically informed each vendor that their participation in future markets would depend on meeting new standards that most of them could not possibly afford." "What sort of standards?" Miss Marple inquired, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Professional display equipment, certified product insurance, commercial-grade packaging, and in several cases replacement of handmade items with factory-produced goods bearing the vendor's personal signature or customization." Inspector Slack accepted his teacup with a grim expression. She was essentially forcing them to abandon everything that made their participation authentic. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "And the financial implications?" "Devastating for most of them. The initial investment required would have been several £1,000s per vendor, with ongoing costs that would have made participation unprofitable for small family businesses. So she was systematically eliminating the traditional vendors." "Precisely. But that's not the most disturbing part." Inspector Slack leaned forward in his chair. "I've also been investigating the financial records we found in her hidden compartment. Mrs. Thornfield had been collecting increasingly high vendor fees for 3 years, ostensibly to cover market expenses and improvements." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "Ostensibly? The actual costs of running the market haven't increased significantly. Most of the additional fees were being diverted into what she called a development fund, but the money was actually being used to finance her negotiations with Charles Hendricks and his commercial development company. So the vendors were unknowingly paying for their own replacement." "Exactly. She was using their money to fund the very project that would have excluded them from the market permanently." Inspector Slack's voice carried a note of genuine outrage. "It's one of the most cynical schemes I've encountered in my career." Miss Marple set down her teacup with a slight clink that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Inspector, did any of the vendors indicate that they were aware of the full scope of Mrs. Thornfield's plans? Most of them suspected that something significant was afoot, but I don't believe anyone understood the complete picture until yesterday. However, ... He paused, consulting his notes again. "Several vendors mentioned seeing Mrs. Thornfield in intense conversation with strangers over the past few months. People who clearly weren't local residents." "Mr. Hendricks and his associates, presumably." "Almost certainly. And there's something else. Mrs. Thornfield had scheduled what she called a final planning meeting for the evening after the market closed. According to her appointment diary, she was expecting to conclude her negotiations and sign definitive agreements. Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing understanding. So December 15th was meant to be the day she secured her new arrangements while simultaneously clearing out the existing vendors. It appears so. She would have had her commercial partners confirmed and the traditional vendors eliminated, leaving her free to implement her new vision for the market. The implications of this timeline were chilling. Margaret Thornfield had chosen to deliver devastating news to people she had worked with for years, people who trusted her, on the very day she planned to finalise the arrangements that would replace them. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "I believe we're dealing with someone who killed not just Margaret Thornfield, but what they saw as a betrayal of everything the Christmas market represented." "My thoughts exactly. The question is identifying which of the vendors had both the opportunity and the knowledge to carry out such a precisely timed murder." Miss Marple rose and moved to her window, gazing out at the village square where the abandoned market stalls stood in the gathering dusk. "You mentioned that Mrs. Thornfield chose cyanide administered through mulled wine. There's something almost symbolic about that choice, don't you think?" Inspector Slack joined her at the window. "How so?" "Mulled wine is one of the most traditional elements of a Christmas market. It represents warmth, hospitality, community sharing. To use it as a vehicle for murder suggests someone who wanted to make a statement about how Mrs. Thornfield had corrupted those very traditions. You think the killer was motivated by more than personal grievance?" "I think the killer saw themselves as defending something precious that was being destroyed for commercial gain." Miss Marple turned from the window with a thoughtful expression. "Inspector, did your investigation reveal whether any of the vendors had knowledge of poisons or access to cyanide?" "An interesting question. Several of them work with various chemicals in their crafts. Timothy Mills uses wood stains and preservatives, Mrs. Fletcher employs dyes for her wool, and others work with cleaning solvents and finishing materials." Inspector Slack paused. "Though cyanide specifically would require either specialised knowledge or access to industrial processes." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Or access to someone who possessed such knowledge." "You're suggesting the killer had help?" "I'm suggesting that murder by cyanide poisoning requires more expertise than most people possess. Either our killer has specialised knowledge, or they consulted with someone who does." Inspector Slack made additional notes. "I'll need to investigate the backgrounds of all our suspects more thoroughly. Look for connections to industrial processes, photography, metal working, or other activities that might involve cyanide compounds." As the inspector prepared to leave, Miss Marple remained at her window, watching the empty market square. The Christmas lights still twinkled among the abandoned stalls, but their cheerful glow now seemed incongruous against the tragedy that had unfolded beneath them. "Inspector," she said suddenly, "I believe you'll find that this murder was committed by someone who saw themselves as saving the Christmas market, not destroying it. The killer chose to corrupt Margaret's personal symbol of tradition and hospitality because she had already corrupted everything else the market represented. A kind of poetic justice. More than that, I think the killer believed they were performing a necessary act of preservation, protecting something precious from someone who was systematically destroying it for personal profit." Inspector Slack paused at the door. "That's a rather charitable interpretation of murder, Miss Marple." "Not charitable, Inspector. Simply realistic. People will go to extraordinary lengths to protect things they love, especially when they feel betrayed by someone they trusted." Miss Marple's voice carried a note of sadness. "Margaret Thornfield created the circumstances that led to her own death by systematically betraying everyone who believed in her stewardship of their community tradition." As the inspector departed into the cold December evening, Miss Marple remained at her window, contemplating the complex web of motives and opportunities that surrounded Margaret Thornfield's murder. Someone among the vendors had decided that killing was preferable to allowing the complete commercialization of their beloved Christmas market. The question that remained was whether that someone had acted alone, or whether the murder represented a more coordinated effort to preserve what Margaret had been determined to destroy. Chapter 6. The Christmas Ornament Clue. The third morning after Margaret Thornfield's death brought fresh snow to St Mary Mead, and Miss Marple found herself once again drawn to the village square. The Christmas market stalls stood like ghosts beneath their covering of white, and the police tape around Margaret's gingerbread house fluttered in the bitter wind. She was surprised to discover Inspector Slack already present, crouched beside the fountain in the centre of the square with one of his constables. They appeared to be examining something small that glinted in the weak winter sunlight. "Miss Marple," the inspector called out upon seeing her approach, "your timing is fortuitous. We've just made what may prove to be a significant discovery." Miss Marple picked her way carefully across the snow-covered cobblestones, her walking stick providing stability on the slippery surface. "What sort of discovery, Inspector?" "A Christmas ornament," he replied, rising to his feet and brushing snow from his knees. "Found wedged between the stones at the base of the fountain, approximately 15 feet from Mrs. Thornfield's stall." He held up a delicate glass bauble, no larger than a robin's egg, painted in intricate patterns of gold and deep red. Despite its small size, the craftsmanship was extraordinary, with tiny details that spoke of hours of careful work. Miss Marple examined the ornament with great interest, though she was careful not to handle the evidence. "How very beautiful, and how very distinctive. This isn't the sort of mass-produced decoration one finds in ordinary shops." "Precisely what we thought. The constable who found it has been making inquiries among the market vendors, but none of them recognise it as their work or recall seeing it among the items for sale." Miss Marple studied the ornament more closely, noting the particular style of the painted design and the quality of the glass itself. "Inspector, might I suggest that you show this to Mrs. Pemberton? She lives in Rose Cottage on the Oakley Road, and she's known throughout the village for her traditional handicrafts." "Mrs. Pemberton?" Inspector Slack made a note in his book. "I don't believe that name appeared on our list of current market vendors." "No, it wouldn't have. Sarah Pemberton was excluded from the market several years ago, though she was one of its original founders." Miss Marple's voice carried a note of regret. "A most unfortunate situation from what I understand." Inspector Slack's expression sharpened immediately. "Excluded? On what grounds?" According to village gossip, Mrs. Thornfield felt that Mrs. Pemberton's methods were too old-fashioned for the market's evolving standards. There was some dispute about display requirements and modernisation of techniques. The implications of this information were immediately apparent to both of them. Inspector Slack carefully wrapped the ornament in tissue paper and secured it in an evidence envelope. "I think we should pay Mrs. Pemberton a visit immediately," he declared. Rose Cottage sat at the end of a winding lane bordered by bare hedgerows, its thatched roof and diamond-paned windows giving it the appearance of something from a storybook. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light glowed in the windows against the grey December afternoon. Mrs. Sarah Pemberton proved to be a woman in her early 70s, with silver hair braided around her head and hands that showed the careful wear of decades spent in detailed craftwork. She invited them into her sitting room with gracious hospitality, though Miss Marple noticed a wariness in her eyes when Inspector Slack introduced himself. "We're investigating the death of Margaret Thornfield," the inspector explained gently. "We understand you had some history with the Christmas market." Mrs. Pemberton's expression grew carefully neutral. "I was involved with the market in its early years. Yes, before it became what it is today." Miss Marple accepted the offered cup of tea and settled herself comfortably in a chintz-covered chair. "You were one of the founding organisers, I believe?" "Along with Margaret and several others, yes. We started it as a way to bring the community together during the Christmas season to celebrate traditional crafts and local talents." Mrs. Pemberton's voice carried unmistakable sadness. "It was a very different sort of event in those days." Inspector Slack produced the ornament they had discovered. "Mrs. Pemberton, we found this near the scene of Mrs. Thornfield's death. We're hoping you might be able to tell us something about its origins." Mrs. Pemberton's face went very pale as she looked at the delicate bauble. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. "May I?" she asked quietly. Inspector Slack hesitated briefly, then carefully unwrapped the ornament and placed it in her hands. Mrs. Pemberton examined it with the attention of someone who understood exactly what she was seeing. "This is my work," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I made this ornament 3 years ago, using the traditional techniques my grandmother taught me." Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. "It's extraordinarily beautiful. The craftsmanship is remarkable." "Thank you. These ornaments were made using blown glass and hand-mixed paints, following methods that date back centuries. Each one required several days to complete." Mrs. Pemberton's voice grew bitter. Margaret dismissed them as quaint anachronisms that had no place in a professional retail environment. Inspector Slack made careful notes. "You said this particular ornament was made 3 years ago. Do you recall what became of it?" Mrs. Pemberton was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with some internal conflict. "I made a dozen ornaments that year, intending them for the Christmas market. It was my final attempt to meet Margaret's new standards. I had hoped—" She paused, collecting herself. "I had hoped they would demonstrate that traditional methods could produce work of exceptional quality." "But Mrs. Thornfield rejected them," Miss Marple asked gently. "She barely looked at them, said they were too time-intensive to be commercially viable, and that customers wanted ornaments they could afford to replace every year." Mrs. Pemberton's hands tightened around the delicate bauble. "She suggested I consider importing mass-produced ornaments from overseas and simply adding my signature to them." The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable, and Miss Marple began to understand the depth of the wound that Margaret's rejection had inflicted. Inspector Slack continued his questioning with professional persistence. "Mrs. Pemberton, what happened to the other ornaments in that collection?" "I gave them away, mostly, to friends who appreciated the work that went into them, to people who understood what traditional craftsmanship represents." She looked down at the ornament in her hands. "I kept 2 for myself as reminders. And this one—" Mrs. Pemberton hesitated again, and Miss Marple sensed that they were approaching something significant. "I gave this one to Margaret," she said finally. "It was a peace offering, I suppose. A way of showing her that we could find common ground, that traditional methods and commercial success weren't mutually exclusive." Inspector Slack's pen stopped moving. "When did you give it to her?" "The day she informed me that my services would no longer be required at the Christmas market. I hoped it might change her mind, might remind her of why we'd started the market in the first place." Miss Marple felt a chill of understanding. "And what was her response?" Mrs. Pemberton's face crumpled slightly. She thanked me politely and set it aside without really looking at it. Then she proceeded to explain why traditional craftspeople like myself were hindering the market's progress toward professional standards. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the soft whisper of snow against the windows. Miss Marple could see the pain in Mrs. Pemberton's eyes, the deep hurt of someone whose life's work had been dismissed as worthless by someone she had trusted. Inspector Slack cleared his throat carefully. "Mrs. Pemberton, I must ask about your whereabouts on the evening of December 15th. "I was here at home, as I am most evenings. I no longer have occasion to visit the village square during market days." Her voice carried quiet dignity despite the circumstances. "Can anyone verify that?" Mrs. Pemberton shook her head slowly. "I live alone, Inspector. I have few visitors these days." As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple noticed the sitting room was filled with examples of Mrs. Pemberton's extraordinary craftsmanship. Hand-painted china, intricate lacework, carved wooden boxes, and dozens of Christmas ornaments that demonstrated skills developed over a lifetime of dedicated practice. "Mrs. Pemberton," she said gently, "you mentioned that you taught your techniques to other craftspeople. Do any of them still participate in the Christmas market?" A shadow crossed Mrs. Pemberton's face. "A few, though they've had to adapt their methods to meet Margaret's requirements. Traditional techniques take time, and time has become the enemy of commercial efficiency." Outside Rose Cottage, Inspector Slack and Miss Marple walked in thoughtful silence through the falling snow. The ornament had provided them with their first concrete link between the crime scene and a specific individual, but it had also revealed the human cost of Margaret Thornfield's commercial ambitions. She had motive, and she had means to access the market through her connections with current vendors, Inspector Slack observed finally. But would a woman of her age and background have the knowledge to commit murder by cyanide poisoning? Miss Marple considered this question carefully. Inspector, I believe you'll find that Mrs. Pemberton's knowledge of traditional crafting methods is more extensive than we might initially suppose. Such techniques often involve chemical processes that have been passed down through generations. As they reached the village square where the abandoned Christmas market stood beneath its blanket of snow, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of Margaret Thornfield's murder. The ornament that had been found near her body represented everything she'd rejected in her pursuit of commercial success, and it had been placed there by someone who understood exactly what that rejection had cost. Chapter 7. A Holiday Vendetta. Inspector Slack spent the following day investigating Mrs. Pemberton's background, and what he discovered painted a picture of systematic exclusion that was even more disturbing than their initial interviews had suggested. He found Miss Marple in the village library, where she was consulting old issues of the Saint, Mary Mead Gazette that documented the Christmas market's early years. Miss Marple, he said, settling into the chair beside her reading table, I believe we've uncovered the full extent of what can only be described as a deliberate campaign to eliminate the market's founding principles. Miss Marple looked up from a newspaper dated 5 years earlier, which featured a photograph of the Christmas market in its traditional form. What sort of campaign, Inspector? Mrs. Pemberton wasn't the only original vendor who was systematically excluded. Over the past 4 years, Margaret Thornfield managed to force out 7 of the 12 founding participants through increasingly restrictive requirements and fee structures. Miss Marple studied the photograph before her, which showed a much simpler market with smaller stalls and vendors who were clearly local residents rather than professional retailers. And what became of these excluded vendors? Most of them simply gave up their crafts or found other outlets for their work, but several of them, including Mrs. Pemberton, had been meeting informally to discuss their grievances and consider possible responses. This information immediately captured Miss Marple's full attention. What sort of responses? Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. Initially, they considered legal action. They felt that Margaret had violated the original charter that established the Christmas market as a community event. However, they discovered that she had been carefully restructuring the market's legal status to give herself complete control over vendor selection and policies. Miss Marple turned to another newspaper article, this one showing Margaret accepting an award for commercial innovation in community events. The contrast with the earlier photographs was striking. How did she manage such a comprehensive transformation without opposition from the village council or other community leaders? That's where the story becomes truly disturbing, Inspector Slack replied grimly. Margaret had been cultivating relationships with local officials, presenting her changes as necessary modernization that would bring increased revenue to the village. She convinced them that traditional vendors were hindering economic development. Miss Marple closed the newspaper with a soft sigh, and the excluded vendors had no recourse. Worse than that, when they attempted to organize an alternative Christmas market, Margaret used her connections to prevent them from obtaining permits or suitable locations. She effectively monopolized Christmas craft sales in St. Mary Mead. The implications of this systematic exclusion were chilling. Margaret hadn't simply been pursuing commercial success. She had been deliberately destroying the livelihoods of people who had trusted her as a partner in their community endeavour. Inspector Slack continued reading from his notes. I interviewed Mrs. Henderson, who was forced out 2 years ago when her hand-dipped candles were deemed inconsistent with fire safety standards. She told me that Margaret had suggested she could continue participating if she agreed to sell factory-made candles with fraudulent labels claiming they were handmade locally. How perfectly dreadful, Miss Marple murmured. She was asking people to compromise their integrity as well as their craftsmanship. And there's more. Mr. Jameson, who had been selling homemade preserves for 8 years, was told his products couldn't meet commercial liability standards unless he used a licensed manufacturing facility. The cost would have been prohibitive for his small operation. Miss Marple reflected on the scope of Margaret's betrayal. Inspector, it seems to me that Mrs. Thornfield was systematically destroying not just individual livelihoods, but the entire concept of community-based commerce that the Christmas market had originally represented. Precisely. And according to the excluded vendors I interviewed, she was quite open about her intentions once she had established control. She told several of them that amateur hobbyists had no place in a professional retail environment. The cruelty of this dismissal was particularly painful, given that many of these amateur hobbyists had been practicing their crafts for decades and had been instrumental in creating the market's original success. Inspector Slack produced another document from his file. This is where the investigation becomes even more troubling. I've obtained a copy of Margaret's business plan for what she called the Saint Mary Mead Christmas Experience. It was to be a year-round tourist attraction featuring professional vendors and manufactured goods marketed as authentic local crafts. Miss Marple examined the business plan with growing dismay. The proposal outlined a complete commercialization of the Christmas market concept, with franchising opportunities and corporate partnerships that would have eliminated any connection to genuine local traditions. She was planning to sell not just the market itself, but the entire identity of St. Mary Mead as a destination for authentic Christmas shopping, she observed. And the profits would have been enormous. The projected revenues were 10 times what the traditional market generated, though none of that money would have remained in the local community. Miss Marple turned to the financial projections section of the business plan. Inspector, look at these vendor fee projections. She was planning to charge individual stall rents that exceeded what most local craftspeople earn in an entire year, which would have made participation impossible for anyone except large commercial operations. The traditional vendors would have been completely priced out of their own community market. As they continued examining the documents, Miss Marple began to understand the full scope of what the excluded vendors had been facing. Margaret hadn't simply been changing the market. She had been systematically destroying everything that had made it meaningful to the community that created it. Inspector, she said thoughtfully, I believe we're dealing with something that goes beyond individual grievances. This business plan represents a complete betrayal of trust and community values. My thoughts exactly. And there's one more disturbing element. According to Charles Hendricks, whom we finally managed to interview yesterday, the franchising agreement was scheduled to be signed on December 16th, the day after Margaret's death. Miss Marple felt a chill of understanding. So December 15th was not only the day she delivered ultimatums to the current vendors, but the final day before she would have legally transferred control of the market to outside commercial interests. Exactly. After that date, even if the excluded vendors had found some way to challenge her actions, it would have been too late. The market would have belonged to a commercial corporation with no ties to St. Mary Mead. The timing of Margaret's murder was beginning to seem less coincidental and more like a calculated intervention designed to prevent an irreversible betrayal of community trust. Inspector Slack gathered his papers carefully. Miss Marple, I'm beginning to suspect that we're dealing with someone who saw Margaret's murder not as a crime, but as a necessary act of preservation. More than that, Inspector, I think we're dealing with someone who understood that December 15th was the last possible day to prevent the complete destruction of everything the Christmas market had originally represented. As they left the library, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic irony of the situation. Margaret Thornfield had been killed on the very day she would have completed her transformation of a beloved community tradition into a commercial enterprise. The killer had chosen to act not from simple revenge, but from a desperate desire to preserve something precious that was about to be lost forever. The question that remained was whether Mrs. Pemberton had acted alone in her holiday vendetta, or whether she had been part of a larger effort by the excluded vendors to protect their community's Christmas traditions from commercial exploitation. Miss Marple suspected that the answer lay in understanding not just who had access to cyanide, but who had possessed the knowledge and determination necessary to plan such a precisely timed intervention. Chapter 8: The Market Manager's Secret. 2 days after their library research, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Mr. Blackwood appeared at her door in the early evening, his usual composure completely shattered, and his hands trembling as he clutched a manila envelope against his chest. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, "I must speak with you. I can't bear this burden any longer, and I believe you're the only person who might understand what I've done." Miss Marple invited him into her sitting room, noting his haggard appearance and the deep shadows under his eyes. She prepared tea while he sat in uncomfortable silence, clearly struggling with some internal conflict that had driven him to seek her counsel. "Mr. Blackwood," she said gently, settling herself across from him, "you appear to be greatly troubled. Perhaps it would help to share whatever is weighing so heavily upon your mind." He opened the manila envelope with shaking fingers and withdrew a collection of documents, photographs, and what appeared to be financial records. "I've been documenting Margaret's activities for over a year, Miss Marple. Everything she was doing to destroy the market, all the lies she told, all the people she betrayed." Miss Marple accepted the offered papers and began examining them with careful attention. What she saw was a meticulous record of Margaret Thornfield's systematic corruption of the Christmas market, documented with the precision of someone who understood exactly what was being destroyed. "These are very thorough records, Mr. Blackwood. May I ask what prompted you to compile such detailed documentation?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "I couldn't stop her, Miss Marple. She had too much influence with the village officials, too many connections with people who saw only the financial benefits of her modernization plans. But I thought if I could gather enough evidence of what she was really doing, perhaps eventually someone would listen." The documents told a devastating story. Margaret had been systematically overcharging vendors while reducing the services provided to them. She'd been collecting fees for improvements that were never made, diverting money intended for community benefit into a private development fund. "Mr. Blackwood, these financial discrepancies are quite significant. Did you ever confront Mrs. Thornfield about them directly?" "I tried several times, but she always had explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface. Administrative costs, planning expenses, contingency funds for future expansion." His laugh was bitter. "It wasn't until I saw the business plan for the Christmas experience that I understood the full scope of her deception." Miss Marple continued reading through the documents, finding evidence of Margaret's meetings with Charles Hendricks, correspondence about eliminating traditional vendors, and detailed plans for commercializing every aspect of the market's operations. "This is quite comprehensive evidence of financial impropriety," she observed. "Were you planning to present this to the authorities?" Mr. Blackwood's expression grew even more troubled. "That's where my own actions become problematic. Miss Marple, I discovered that Margaret was planning to expose me for embezzlement if I interfered with her arrangements with Hendricks." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows inquiringly, and Mr. Blackwood continued with obvious difficulty. "Over the past 2 years I had been taking small amounts from the market's accounts to help vendors who couldn't afford Margaret's increased fees. Mrs. Fletcher's stall rental, Timothy Mill's insurance costs, several others who are struggling to meet the new requirements." "I see. And Mrs. Thornfield discovered this?" "She'd been monitoring all financial transactions much more closely than I realized. She confronted me 3 weeks ago and made it clear that she would report my actions to the police unless I cooperated with her plans to eliminate opposition to the commercialization project." Miss Marple began to understand the impossible position in which Mr. Blackwood had found himself. His attempts to help struggling vendors had made him vulnerable to blackmail by the very person who was creating their difficulties. What sort of cooperation did she demand? She wanted me to actively discourage vendors from organizing any resistance to her new policies. She also wanted me to provide her with detailed information about their financial situations so she could determine which ones were most vulnerable to pressure. The cruelty of this request was breathtaking. Margaret had not only been systematically destroying the traditional vendors, but she had attempted to force their longtime ally to participate in their elimination. And your response to these demands? Mr. Blackwood's face crumpled. I tried to delay, to find some alternative solution. I hoped that if I could gather enough evidence of her corruption, it might provide leverage to protect both myself and the vendors. But she was becoming increasingly impatient. Miss Marple examined a series of letters from Margaret to Mr. Blackwood, clearly documenting her threats and demands. The tone was coldly professional, but the implications were unmistakable. Mr. Blackwood, did Mrs. Thornfield give you any specific deadline for your cooperation? December 16th. She said that after her meeting with Hendricks was concluded, she would expect my full compliance with her new administrative procedures, or she would have no choice but to report my embezzlement to Inspector Slack. Miss Marple felt a familiar chill of understanding. December 16th, the day after Margaret's murder, had been intended as the beginning of a new phase in her commercialization plans, a phase that would have required Mr. Blackwood's active participation in betraying the vendors he had been trying to protect. I assume you're sharing this information with me because you believe it may be relevant to Mrs. Thornfield's death? Mr. Blackwood nodded miserably. I can't help wondering if my documentation of her activities might have contributed to what happened. Several vendors knew I was keeping records, and some of them had asked to see evidence of Margaret's financial manipulations. Which vendors specifically? Mrs. Pemberton, certainly. She had been particularly interested in the financial aspects of Margaret's control over the market. Mrs. Fletcher had also asked several questions about where the increased fees were actually being spent. Miss Marple made mental notes of these connections. Both women had clear motives for wanting Margaret stopped, and both had been aware that detailed evidence of her corruption existed. Mr. Blackwood, did you share any of these documents with Mrs. Pemberton or the other excluded vendors? He hesitated before answering. I showed Mrs. Pemberton some of the financial records, yes. She had been one of the original organisers, and I felt she deserved to know how Margaret was misusing funds that were supposed to support community traditions. And her reaction? She was devastated, not just by the financial betrayal, but by the scope of Margaret's deception. She kept saying that Margaret had destroyed something precious that could never be rebuilt. Miss Marple could imagine Mrs. Pemberton's reaction to learning that her life's work had been systematically undermined by someone she had trusted as a partner in preserving traditional craftsmanship. Mr. Blackwood, I must ask about your whereabouts on the evening of December 15th. I was at the market until closing time, as always, but I stayed late that evening trying to complete some financial reconciliations before Margaret's meeting with Hendricks the following day. He paused. I was in the market office, which is in the building behind the fountain. I had a clear view of Margaret's stall through the window. And what did you observe? Margaret's usual closing routine. She secured her merchandise, cleaned her work area, and prepared her evening cup of mulled wine. But I also noticed someone approaching her stall from the direction of Rose Cottage Lane, though I couldn't identify who it was in the darkness. Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. Approximately what time was this? Just after 7 o'clock, I believe. Most of the other vendors had already departed, but Margaret was always among the last to leave. This timing aligned perfectly with Dr. Haydock's estimation of when the cyanide had been administered to Margaret's mulled wine. Someone had approached her stall during the narrow window when the poison would have been most effective. As Mr. Blackwood prepared to leave, clutching his documentation with evident relief at having shared his burden, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of relationships and motivations that had surrounded Margaret Thornfield in her final days. The market manager's revelations had provided crucial information about both the scope of Margaret's corruption and the knowledge possessed by her potential victims. Someone had used that knowledge to plan a murder timed to prevent the final destruction of St. Mary Mead's Christmas traditions, and Miss Marple was beginning to understand exactly who that someone might be. Chapter 9, Truth in the Snow. The snow began falling again on the morning Miss Marple decided it was time to gather all the suspects together. She had spent the previous evening in careful contemplation, arranging the pieces of evidence in her mind like the components of one of Mrs. Pemberton's intricate ornaments. By dawn, the pattern had become clear, though the truth it revealed was both tragic and inevitable. Inspector Slack arrived at her cottage shortly after breakfast, his expression grave as he stomped the snow from his boots. "Miss Marple, I believe we're ready to make an arrest. The evidence against Mrs. Pemberton is substantial and her motive is clear." Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea and settled herself thoughtfully in her favourite chair. "Indeed, Inspector, the evidence does point toward Mrs. Pemberton. But I wonder if we might gather everyone at the Christmas market this afternoon. I believe there are aspects of this case that require clarification before we proceed." Inspector Slack raised his eyebrows. "What sort of clarification?" "The sort that comes from understanding not just who committed this crime, but why it was necessary and how it was accomplished." Miss Marple's voice carried that gentle certainty that he had learned to respect. "I think you'll find that the truth is both simpler and more complex than our evidence might initially suggest." By 3 o'clock that afternoon, snow was falling steadily on the village square, transforming the abandoned Christmas market into something that looked almost magical, despite the tragedy that had occurred there. Inspector Slack had assembled all the principal figures: Mrs. Fletcher, Timothy Mills, Mr. Blackwood, and Mrs. Pemberton, along with Dr. Haydock and several constables. Miss Marple stood near the fountain in the centre of the square, the Christmas lights twinkling overhead as she surveyed the small group that had gathered around her. Margaret Thornfield's gingerbread house stall loomed behind them, still draped with police tape that fluttered in the cold wind. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp air, "we are here because someone among us decided that murder was preferable to allowing the complete destruction of something precious. I believe it's time we understood exactly what happened on the evening of December 15th, and why." Mrs. Pemberton stood slightly apart from the others, her dignity intact despite the circumstances. Her silver hair was covered with a woolen shawl, and her hands were clasped calmly before her as she waited for Miss Marple to continue. "The murder of Margaret Thornfield was not a crime of passion, nor was it motivated by simple revenge. It was a carefully planned intervention, timed to prevent an irreversible betrayal of community trust." Miss Marple paused, allowing her words to settle. "Mrs. Pemberton, you discovered the full scope of Margaret's plans through your conversations with Mr. Blackwood and your own investigation into the market's changing financial structure." Mrs. Pemberton inclined her head slightly but said nothing. Miss Marple continued. "You learned that December 15th was the final day before Margaret would sign agreements that would transfer control of the Christmas market to commercial interests. After that date, even if the community had eventually discovered her deception, it would have been too late to save the traditions you had helped create." Inspector Slack stepped forward. "Miss Marple, while Mrs. Pemberton certainly had motive, we still haven't established how she obtained access to cyanide or how she managed to administer it to Mrs. Thornfield's mulled wine." "Ah, Inspector, that's where Mrs. Pemberton's expertise in traditional crafting methods becomes significant." Miss Marple turned to address the elderly woman directly. "You didn't obtain cyanide from an industrial source, did you, Mrs. Pemberton? You extracted it using traditional methods that have been known to craft people for centuries." Mrs. Pemberton's composure finally cracked slightly. "Traditional jewellery cleaning," she said quietly. "My grandmother taught me the old methods for cleaning tarnished silver, bitter almonds and other natural sources processed using techniques that date back generations." Dr. Haydock looked startled. "Good heavens, you're right. Traditional silver cleaning did involve compounds that could produce cyanide when processed incorrectly. Most people abandoned those methods decades ago when safer alternatives became available." Miss Marple nodded. "But Mrs. Pemberton maintained the old knowledge because she believed in preserving traditional techniques, even when they were no longer commercially practical." Mrs. Pemberton's voice was barely audible. "I never intended to use that knowledge for harm, but when I understood what Margaret was planning to do, When I realised that December 15th was our last chance to save the market, she trailed off, unable to continue. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but inexorable. You used your connections with the current vendors to gain access to the market after closing time. Someone you had trained in traditional techniques helped you approach Margaret's stall without being observed. Timothy Mills shifted uncomfortably, his young face pale in the falling snow. Mrs. Pemberton taught my grandfather woodworking techniques when I was a child. When she explained what Margaret was planning to do, I couldn't bear the thought of losing the only community connection I had left. Inspector Slack made notes rapidly. So you assisted Mrs. Pemberton in gaining access to the market? I was supposed to create a distraction while she spoke with Margaret one final time. We hoped we might still convince her to abandon her commercial plans. Timothy's voice cracked, but when Mrs. Pemberton saw Margaret drinking her mulled wine and talking about her meeting with Hendricks the next day, she realised that talking wouldn't change anything. Mrs. Pemberton found her voice again. Margaret was gloating, Miss Marple. She spoke about how foolish the traditional vendors had been to think they could compete with modern commercial methods. She laughed about the excluded vendors trying to organise alternative markets. Miss Marple could imagine the scene. Margaret Thornfield, secure in her triumph, casually dismissing the concerns of someone whose life's work she had systematically destroyed. So you added the cyanide to her mulled wine, Inspector Slack stated. I had brought it with me, hoping I would find the courage to take my own life rather than watch everything I valued be destroyed. Mrs. Pemberton's voice was steady now, as if confession had brought relief. But when I heard Margaret's callous dismissal of everyone she had betrayed, I realised that my death would accomplish nothing. Hers, however, might save the market. The wind picked up, sending snow swirling around the group as they absorbed the full implications of Mrs. Pemberton's confession. Miss Marple stepped closer to the elderly woman. You left your ornament near Margaret's stall as a symbol, didn't you? A reminder of the traditional craftsmanship she had rejected. It seemed appropriate. That ornament represented everything she claimed to value but was actually destroying. I wanted it to be found, to make people understand what we had lost. Inspector Slack moved forward with obvious reluctance. Mrs. Sarah Pemberton, I am arresting you for the murder of Margaret Thornfield. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say will be taken down and may be used in evidence. As the constables gently escorted Mrs. Pemberton toward the waiting police car, she turned back to address the small group one final time. I don't expect forgiveness for what I've done, but I hope you'll understand that some things are worth preserving, even at a terrible cost. Her voice carried across the snowy square. The Christmas market can still be saved if people remember what it was meant to represent. Timothy Mills stepped forward impulsively. Mrs. Pemberton will make sure it's saved, I promise you that. As the police car disappeared into the swirling snow, Miss Marple stood quietly in the abandoned market square, reflecting on the tragic necessity that had driven a gentle woman to commit murder. Margaret Thornfield's betrayal had created circumstances where violence seemed like the only way to preserve something precious, and the cost of that preservation would haunt St. Mary Mead for years to come. The Christmas lights continued to twinkle overhead, but their cheerful glow now seemed to mock the tragedy that had unfolded beneath them. Someone had died to save the Christmas market, but Miss Marple wondered whether the market itself could survive the knowledge of what that salvation had required. Chapter 10. Justice Under the Christmas Lights. 3 weeks after Mrs. Pemberton's arrest, Miss Marple found herself once again in the village square, though the circumstances were vastly different from that tragic evening when Margaret Thornfield had met her death. The Christmas market had been reopened under emergency management by the village council, with Mr. Blackwood serving as interim coordinator while a permanent solution was developed. Inspector Slack joined her near the fountain, where they could observe the quiet activity of vendors setting up their stalls for what many hoped would be the market's renewal. The atmosphere was subdued but determined, as if the community was consciously choosing to reclaim something precious that had nearly been lost. The magistrators agreed to consider Mrs. Pemberton's age and circumstances when determining her sentence, Inspector Slack reported. There's significant community support for leniency, given the nature of Mrs. Thornfield's betrayal. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Public opinion can be a powerful force, particularly when people feel that justice is more complex than the simple application of law. They watched as Timothy Mills arranged his wooden toys in a stall that was larger and better positioned than the cramped space he had been relegated to under Margaret's administration. His craftsmanship was being displayed with the respect it deserved, and several customers were already examining his work with genuine appreciation. The young man has been instrumental in organising the market's restoration, Inspector Slack observed. He's been working with Mrs. Fletcher and the other traditional vendors to establish new policies that honour the original community spirit while ensuring financial stability. Mrs. Fletcher appeared at that moment carrying a box of her hand-knitted scarves toward her stall. Her expression was still sharp, but there was a lightness to her step that had been absent during Margaret's reign. "Miss Marple," she called out, "I wanted to thank you for helping us understand what really happened. The truth was painful, but it was necessary." Miss Marple accepted her thanks graciously. "I'm pleased to see the market continuing, Mrs. Fletcher. I believe that's what Mrs. Pemberton would have wanted most." "Indeed it is. We've established a fund to help with her legal expenses, and we're planning to feature her traditional ornaments as a permanent memorial to authentic craftsmanship." Mrs. Fletcher's voice carried genuine emotion. "It seems the least we can do for someone who sacrificed everything to preserve what we all valued." As Mrs. Fletcher continued toward her stall, Miss Marple reflected on the complex nature of the justice that had emerged from this tragedy. Mrs. Pemberton would face legal consequences for her actions, but the community had chosen to honour her motives while ensuring that her sacrifice had not been in vain. Mr. Blackwood approached them, carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression of cautious optimism. "Miss Marple, Inspector, I'm pleased to report that we've received applications from 15 traditional vendors who wish to participate in the restored market. Several of them are craftspeople who were excluded under Mrs. Thornfield's policies." "And the financial arrangements?" Inspector Slack inquired. "We've returned to the original fee structure and established transparent accounting procedures. All vendor fees will be used exclusively for market operations and community improvements, with quarterly reports available to anyone who requests them." Mr. Blackwood's relief was evident. No one person will ever again have unilateral control over the market's policies or finances. Miss Marple found this development particularly gratifying. "I believe Mrs. Pemberton would be pleased to know that her actions led to genuine reform, rather than simply preventing Margaret's commercial takeover." Dr. Haydock joined their group, his medical bag in hand as he made his morning rounds through the village. "I've just come from visiting Mrs. Pemberton in custody," he reported. "She's holding up remarkably well, all things considered. Her primary concern seems to be ensuring that the market continues to operate according to traditional principles." "And her physical health?" Miss Marple asked with genuine concern. "Stable, though the stress of the situation has taken its toll. She's been spending her time writing detailed instructions for various traditional crafting techniques, apparently concerned that the knowledge might be lost if she's unable to pass it on directly." This information touched Miss Marple deeply. Even in custody, facing the consequences of her desperate action, Mrs. Pemberton was still working to preserve the traditional knowledge that had motivated her crime. Inspector Slack consulted his watch. "I should mention that Charles Hendricks and his development company have withdrawn their interest in the St. Mary Mead Christmas market. Apparently the publicity surrounding Mrs. Thornfield's murder has made the project commercially unviable." Miss Marple couldn't suppress a slight smile. How very convenient for the community's interests. Indeed, the village council has also passed new regulations preventing any individual from gaining exclusive control over community events. Future market policies will require approval from a committee of vendors and village representatives. As they continued their conversation, Miss Marple noticed more vendors arriving to set up their stalls. The scene was remarkably similar to what the Christmas market had looked like in its early years, before Margaret's commercial ambitions had begun to transform it into something unrecognisable. A young woman approached Timothy Mill's stall carrying what appeared to be samples of handmade pottery. Miss Marple could overhear their conversation about traditional glazing techniques and the importance of preserving authentic craftsmanship methods. New vendors, she inquired of Mr. Blackwood. Several of them, yes. Word has spread throughout the region about our commitment to supporting traditional craftspeople. We're receiving applications from artisans who share Mrs. Pemberton's values regarding authentic handmade goods. Miss Marple found this development deeply satisfying. Mrs. Pemberton's sacrifice had not only prevented the commercialisation of the Christmas market, but had actually strengthened its commitment to the principles she had fought to preserve. As the afternoon progressed and the market began to take on the appearance of a functioning community event, Miss Marple made her way slowly through the stalls. The vendors greeted her warmly, many of them expressing gratitude for her role in uncovering the truth about Margaret's betrayal and ensuring that Mrs. Pemberton's motives were understood. At the central fountain where Margaret's gingerbread house had once stood, a simple wooden stall now displayed a collection of traditional Christmas ornaments created by various local craftspeople. A small sign indicated that proceeds from sales would benefit the Mrs. Pemberton Legal Defence Fund. Inspector Slack joined her there as the December sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. It's remarkable how quickly the community has rallied to restore the market's original character. Miss Marple picked up one of the ornaments, a delicate glass bauble painted in the style that Mrs. Pemberton had perfected. People will go to extraordinary lengths to preserve things they truly value, Inspector. Mrs. Pemberton's crime was terrible, but it arose from genuine love for something beautiful that was being destroyed. Do you think she acted correctly? Inspector Slack asked quietly. Miss Marple considered the question carefully. I think she acted as her conscience demanded when all other options had been exhausted. Whether that constitutes correctness is a question that each of us must answer individually. As the Christmas lights began to twinkle overhead, Miss Marple reflected on the strange form of justice that had emerged from this tragedy. Margaret Thornfield's death had saved the Christmas market, but at a cost that would forever change how the community understood the relationship between preservation and sacrifice. The market would continue, perhaps stronger than before, in its commitment to authentic traditions and community values. Mrs. Pemberton would face the legal consequences of her actions, but she would also be remembered as someone who had given everything to protect something precious. Miss Marple made her way home through the falling snow, leaving behind a Christmas market that had been reborn through tragedy, but remained true to the principles that had originally inspired its creation. The Christmas lights continued to shine over the village square, no longer mocking the events that had occurred beneath them, but serving as a reminder that some things are indeed worth preserving, even at the most terrible cost.